So much cash flows through our community at all times, but why aren't we using more public funds to end our affordable housing crisis? Today on CityCast Las Vegas, we talk with Nevada State Treasurer Zach Conine. Since his election in 2018, he's been a masterful force in growing our budget surplus. We'll talk about how Desert Pines Golf Course in East Las Vegas is about to convert to affordable housing utilizing public funds. So is this a one-off or just the start of our crisis finally coming to an end? It's Wednesday, December 18th. I'm David Figler, and here's what Las Vegas is talking about. You know, Zach, when I told my wife that I was going to be talking with you on CityCast Las Vegas, she said, well, good luck with that battle of wits. You will lose. Welcome to the program, friend.
Well, happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Zach, we see studies constantly coming out that list the affordable housing crisis in Southern Nevada as one of the most severe in the country. Let me ask you right off, why do you think we're doing so poorly?
Well, I think we have a housing crisis similar to a lot of other metropolitan areas, a lot of rural areas. Frankly, the country has a housing problem, right? But in Nevada, our housing problem is a little bit worse because of the way that housing problems start. And so housing problems don't just happen overnight. It's not like we wake up one day and we're in the middle of a housing crisis. They happen over time because the amount of time it takes to start and finish a construction project in the housing space takes as long as it does. And that's everywhere. And so when housing starts, which is the number of new houses that are kind of going into construction, when that slowed down around the Great Recession, we never caught up. And so we've never built enough houses since then to deal with our increased population. And people really want to come here, right? They love to live in Nevada for all the reasons why we love to live in Nevada, specifically the strength of our state treasury, but also just, you know, the things that make the town great, like this podcast.
I appreciate that. But let me ask, why Las Vegas? Why are we so severe? Why are we doing so poorly? If everyone is having this problem, why are we at the bottom of that list?
Well, some of it has to do with how bad the Great Recession was, right? There was a lot more reluctance after 2010 to do new housing starts here because of how big the bubble got and how painful it was when it burst, right? That's thing number one. And so that limited supply. Thing number two is we've had a crazy amount of demand, right? We've been either the first or second largest growth in population state for the last 10 years. And so more people, less supply, bigger difference between supply and demand curves, and therefore a greater crisis.
Any other challenges unique to Southern Nevada, especially when it comes to catching up or closing this gap, which I understand is just, almost 100,000 units?
Yeah, I think, Nevada is sort of in the middle of the road, maybe a little bit better than the middle of the road when it comes to the time from project being considered to project being built. California, right, the average amount of time for an affordable housing project is nearing 20 years. In Nevada, it's closer to 3 years, right? We certainly have a lot of federal land. Some of that federal land is in places where we'd want to build affordable housing. I think it's important just to maybe level set here about kind of when we say affordable, what we mean versus attainable versus others.
Yeah, I think that's a good explainer. It's a pretty commonly accepted definition, but can you tell us what affordable housing means when we're using that term?
Yeah. So when someone in the space says affordable housing, I'll often say big A affordable housing. In other words, capital affordable housing, which generally means housing that is restricted to individuals making less than 60% of area median income, right? So these are individuals who just do not have the money to pay market rate housing. And so the government broadly steps in through a series of different sort of financial mechanics, right, to bring down the cost of that housing to the developer. And then in exchange, the developer agrees to sort of limit the rents for the period of time that's in the deal, usually around 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's formulaic. It's
why it's super formulaic.
People spending too much of their income on housing is a bad thing, and therefore there's no affordable housing, or people aren't being able to get into safe housing that they want to, or buy a starter house or something like that. I mean, that is what's hitting our community.
Yeah, and sort of by and large, right? The rule of thumb is we don't want people to spend more than 30% of their income on housing, whether that's for a mortgage or for rent. And so affordable housing is targeted to that, right? If you are at that income, you will spend 30% of your of that income on rent, right? Whatever that number is. Obviously, it goes up if you've got children or multiple people living in the house. It goes down if you're by yourself. Same way that area median income is typically calculated, right? Beyond affordable housing, we generally refer to workforce housing as between 80 and 120% of area median income, right? We did a study recently. A great developer in town named Jess Molaski has done a ton of work on this. And he went through and looked and found that a majority of their renters in their sort of market rate housing weren't in the 80% range. They were in the 100, 120% range, right? That there are people who are, doing just fine from an average perspective who are renting. Now, not all renters want to be homeowners, right? Some renters want to be renters, and we've certainly seen that be a shift demographically, right? I'm an elder millennial, but some of the younger millennials in the room, would prefer to rent versus own. But, broadly, Nevada's housing crisis is existential. And it's existential because if people don't have a place to live, all the other parts of the society that we want to work break. Right? It's harder to get a better K through 12 education if you don't know where your kid's going to sleep at night. It's harder to start a business if you're not sure where you're going to rest your head. A colleague of ours in the housing space said a couple of months ago that houses are where jobs go to sleep at night, right? Which is why I think all of government is really focused on pulling every lever we can get our hands on in order to make this housing crisis less bad.
Yeah. And Zach, you used a term that I've been hearing a lot more of lately. It seems like some of this conversation is being rebranded. What is the purpose of introducing the term workforce housing versus affordable housing in this bigger discussion?
So workforce housing has been around for a long time. And it speaks to, I guess there's sort of two big market forces that we think about, right? You want to build housing for the individuals who need it. There are plenty of individuals who could not qualify for big A affordable housing. They make too much money. And so if you're only building big A affordable housing, those individuals can't live there, like under the agreement that housing was built by legally.
So we're talking about people who have decent salaries, but they're not making enough money to really survive in a housing space in our community. Nurses and probably beginning police officers, school teachers for sure. That's all workforce housing?
Yeah. And it's just another way to tier from an income level the type of housing that we're looking at. But I think it's important just broadly, right, to get a concept out there, which is we have a supply problem. There is not enough supply in the market. And building all supply helps in a properly working environment. All supply helps lower the cost of housing. In other words, if you build an affordable unit, it will lower the cost of everyone's housing. If you not by a ton, given like the number of units that we're talking about here, but each unit helps. If you build workforce housing, it helps. If you build a mansion, it helps. Obviously, the government
not as much.
Yeah, but it does.
I'm not gonna support building more mansions in our community if that land could be used better.
I mean, look, I think the government obviously doesn't have a role there, right? But if you look at what happened in northern Nevada, you saw displacement. So individuals came in from California, purchased the nicest houses in the market, which meant that the people who originally were purchasing the nicest houses in the market purchased like the second nicest, and the second nicest to the third nicest to the fourth nicest. And eventually people who were buying homes had to rent, and people who were renting had to walk and move into weeklies, and people who were in weeklies became displaced and became homeless, right? Like all supply matters because generally people don't live in two houses.
Right.
You might rent them, but they don't live in two houses.
And not to put all the blame on Californians. I mean, certainly Wall Street was involved in buying up a lot of properties as well as investments, and that's been kind of problematic. But let me shift focus. The reason we're having you on for this topic, though we could talk to you about a ton of different topics, is that it's our understanding that the Treasurer's Office has a special role in this equation of tackling the affordable housing crisis. And we saw part of that in this new Desert Pines project. So I guess just a straightforward question, how does the Treasurer's Office fit into the equation?
Sure. So for any of your listeners who don't know, although I'm sure everyone follows what we do in the Treasury very closely, but for anyone who doesn't, so the Treasurer, I am the state's chief investment officer, right? I'm responsible for making sure that we have a little bit more in the future. We get to do a lot of long-term planning work in the Treasury, and we've had some success, right? We started when I took office managing about $2.8 billion, and today we manage about $10 billion, right? Mm-hmm. We've made more money in investment returns in the last year than any other term of any treasurer. I happen to be the 23rd person in this job. We've made more money than every other treasurer put together now times two. So we're doing okay. But when we look at it from our perch, sort of the things that are long-term problems of Nevada that we can impact directly, right? Where there's work that can be done and we know that that work will have a positive benefit. Housing is, for lack of a better word, central casting in that play, right?
It's fundamental.
It's fundamental. And it's something that we know how to do, right? Plenty of arguments about the best way to fix education in our community, plenty of arguments about what the best solutions are for mental health and for gun violence and for attracting doctors to the state, right? Housing is in some ways simpler. If we build more housing, we'll be in better shape than we are now. And so we have for years, the treasurer has served on the state board of finance, along with the governor and the controller and some other members. And our work there has been, again, for a long time, dedicating more dollars towards housing through private activity bonds, which is primarily how affordable housing gets funded. To that end, since I took office, we've put more than $2 billion into affordable housing. Most affordable housing projects end up touching that source of financing, whether or not it comes from the state or the county or the city. So we've been doing that work.
Of that money, I'm just curious, is there a breakdown just generally? I don't need the specific, but is it being evenly distributed throughout the state, or is Southern Nevada getting the lion's share?
It is proportionate to population, I think, is the best way to think about it. We do a lot of projects in Southern Nevada. We do some projects in Washoe County, and we occasionally are able to put together a project in the rural counties. Those are harder, but the housing division, who does a lot of that work and are just excellent public servants, really focus on making sure that it's as sort of fairly distributed as possible. During the pandemic, our office leaned into housing by securing forbearance, right, for Nevada residents. That's something that we were able to get done by functionally threatening some of the big banks, which worked. And so Nevada was the second state in the nation to have the ability for people to put their mortgages into forbearance because of our work.
Basically on hold.
Yeah, basically on hold.
During that rough time. But that's all done now.
That's all, well, yeah. But it kind of speaks to the sort of work. We didn't just show up on housing, right? I guess is my point here.
Okay.
And then during the end of the pandemic, when all that federal money showed up, our office conducted a listening tour where we went around the state. And one of the things that came up most clearly was this need for help with affordable housing. And so Nevada dedicated $500 million to a project called Home Means Nevada, which you might have heard about, which has been building affordable housing, which is the largest percentage of ARPA dollars that went into housing from any state, right? So all of those things have been putting as much government focus on housing as possible, and we've been in the middle of all of it here in the Treasury. Desert Pines specifically is the second housing project to come out of Nevada's State Infrastructure Bank. The State Infrastructure Bank was originally created in 2017, like a lot of good ideas in government, sort of passed legislatively and then put on a shelf. Not a lot happened. We, in 2021, revised it to include things like housing, education, other purposes, and we're able to use the state's credit rating, which is the highest it's been in the history of the state, in order to borrow money to fund it.
Can you just explain the infrastructure bank to me like I'm 8 years old? Because it sounds like a big thing, but it was something that you said was shelved and then revived. What is the infrastructure bank?
So the infrastructure bank it's a bank. It creates loans. Those loans can be given to municipalities or nonprofits or tribal communities. And it functionally exists. We like to say that it focuses on but-for projects, right? So the goal of the bank is to help projects that could be built but couldn't because there was just some funding gap. For instance, we were the final dollars going into Safe Nest's new campus. We were the final dollars to build a fire station in West Wendover up in the northeast part of the state, and they never had a fire station since the founding of the town.
And this is coming through the infrastructure bank.
And this is all infrastructure bank loans. Some of them are able to help economic development, but one of the key things that we started to talk about when we kind of created the bank or recreated the bank was this need for housing. And it's all based on leverage, right? So we want to, when the state does housing work, it brings in some federal money, right, to do affordable housing work, but it has always relied on local developers, which is great, and they're great, but we have a bigger problem than we have local developers and local money.
Yeah.
And so with the State Infrastructure Bank, our goal was, hey, can we go find just big pockets of money that we can bring to the state of Nevada to invest in housing? And Desert Pines is a great example of that.
Is it true that the infrastructure bank that the motivation for creating that the first time around was a anticipation that the first Trump administration was going to just dump a lot of infrastructure money into our state, and we needed a mechanism to distribute that, and then it didn't happen?
It predates my service in elected office back when I was in the private sector doing other stuff. But that's our understanding, right? That there was all these conversations, right? It's about to be infrastructure week. It's about to be infrastructure week. It's about to be infrastructure week, right? Of course, it wasn't infrastructure week until President Biden made it infrastructure year. But when former president, soon to be President Trump, was talking about infrastructure, one of the concepts was there would be a federal or a national infrastructure bank, and states would need a vehicle in order to accept that money. And so that vehicle was created. Obviously, Infrastructure Week didn't show up. And so we were able to, as we have often done, find ways in the Treasury to take existing pieces of law and make them effective for Nevadans today.
What's the anticipation with the second Trump administration as it relates to infrastructure and, I guess, the infrastructure bank, too?
We haven't heard a lot. I mean, there's been a lot of conversations about tariffs. Obviously, tariffs will make housing broadly more expensive, at least in the short term, right? When we start looking at tariffs on materials and things like that, right? Sort of by its nature. Mass deportation would obviously increase the cost of housing. There are some individuals who might get caught up in that who work in housing and in construction and in restaurants and live next to you. But that's a separate topic, perhaps.
Right. It is a separate topic, Zach.
It is a separate topic. But, I think we don't know. President-elect Trump has talked about releasing more federal lands. Our governor's talked about that, as has our congressional delegation. I think we all agree that it would be helpful for some federal lands to be released for housing. But I think it's really important to talk about what federal lands are released, right? The state of Nevada is, more than 80% federal lands. And there's a lot of the state where we couldn't build housing that would be effective for anyone to live in. Right.
Yeah. Or effective for the burros or the coyotes or for our environment or our water,
All those things. Right.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to realize that if you're going to build effectively affordable housing, it needs to be near services and jobs and transportation. Right. If you build affordable housing and the rent's real cheap, right, but it's 2 hours away from anything that people could live or work in, it becomes unaffordable because of the logistics.
Well, I want to follow up on that because you're right. Our governor, our federal representatives, even new Mayor Shelley Berkley have been talking about, that the panacea is opening up all this Bureau of Land Management land. And it seems like no one really wants to seriously talk about infill anymore. It doesn't seem wise, especially since we have reports coming out of the RTC that, they have an inventory of 82,000 acres of potential area waiting to transform in southern Nevada.
Yeah, and I think infill is a topic as well, right? It's easy to, and it's not wrong, right? The process of getting land out of the BLM, especially and inclusive of infill land, right? We just did a groundbreaking at a property that is functionally infill land that was owned by the BLM in the city of Las Vegas, exactly where you would want to build affordable housing. It's important for me to make it very clear that all levels of government, all branches of government, all parties of government in Nevada are focused on this work. We're focused on it perhaps differently, right? But those things are not in conflict with each other, right? Our work in the Treasury is about bringing additional dollars and resources into the state. The governor and the federal delegation are extremely well positioned to push for a faster BLM process, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just wondering if it's overshadowing and if there needs to be more pushback.
I don't think so, right? Because the concept, at least to me, David, the concept of overshadowing implies that one thing takes away from the other. I don't think they do. I don't think any person who's seriously involved in housing would say that the BLM fixes everything, but I don't think I know anyone seriously involved in housing that says that the BLM fix wouldn't actually help, right? I think all of this matters.
So you're saying that Governor Lombardo and our federal representatives are not serious about this?
No, I'm saying they are. No, because they're not saying it's just the BLM.
I'm joking, but they do seem to be really pushing that BLM thing over and above every other conversation. And that's frustrating to people like me.
I don't know if you've ever had to work with the BLM, but it is from a government perspective,
it definitely needs to be
streamlined. Bureaucratic thing on the planet, right?
I get that.
Look, and to the extent one of the largest input costs for affordable housing is land, like any other development. And so if you're looking at a patch of land owned by the BLM, in a perfect place to do affordable housing, and it takes 7 to 8 years to get it transitioned over, I'd be pissed too.
Yeah, no, that's rough. But, again, I just think that saying BLM is our answer is a little short-sighted. And I just hope the conversations in public extend beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it is always, it would be myopic to only focus on that. I can assure you that the federal delegation, the governor, and literally anyone else talking about that is not only focused on that. Right.
Okay.
It's a much broader conversation.
All right. I'll be scanning those press releases a little bit more carefully then, based on your inspiration there. Well, let's turn back to Desert Pines for a second. I mean, if this project turns out to be successful, do you think we're going to see more areas like golf courses in our desert turning into affordable housing?
Well, I think it's great to take any piece of Desert Pines, right? Infill, the definition of infill in East Las Vegas, where we definitely need those types of projects. It'll end up being hundreds of workforce units, right? Thousands of affordable housing units, a community center, an early education center, job training, commercial space, public spaces, right? It's not like it's all going to be, sort of wall-to-wall housing, right?
Yeah, in an area of East Las Vegas that has seen better times, this really sounds like a blessing about to arrive. Is it really going to happen?
Yeah, for sure. We don't. Okay. I don't want to be weird, but the Treasury generally does not get over our skis. And we've got excellent partners, right? I mean, we were able to lever in the state money about 18 to 1, right? So every dollar of state money is matched by $18 of our different partners. And one of them, and I think this is really important, housing, if done correctly, can also be a way to create good paying, middle class supporting jobs in our community, right? We don't have to find the cheapest solution. In our case, we're actually able to find a solution that is the cheapest solution and will create great jobs. This will be the largest affordable housing project in the history of the state, and we're building it under a project labor agreement with union labor.
I got to say this, Zach, there are some economists who point to the requirement of a prevailing state wage for construction on residential projects as a serious impediment to developing more affordable housing, that it just pencils different when you are having that as a requirement, the same for commercial building as you do have for residential. Can you explain this requirement of a prevailing state wage and how it came to be and how we work with such a limitation?
Well, I think I'd push back on the limitation, right? I mean, The role of government here and the role of prevailing wages to make sure that when the state is involved in a project, right, that we are paying people a fair wage. And that fair wage is a calculation that those different groups go through. Now, we don't have a separate prevailing wage for residential construction versus commercial. That's a thing we could fix. Doesn't fit within the Treasury. It's not really within our scope of work, but it's assuredly something that could be done. I think what we found with Desert Pines, what we found with Carville Park, which is another project that we're doing up north, is that different projects require and need and can support different things. We were able to find a capital partner who shared our values when it came to labor, who shared our values when it came to pricing, where we were able to get more bang for our buck doing this project with union labor, with a project labor agreement, than we would have been without. And I certainly encourage, right? I mean, I think we should look at every tool in our toolbox in order to build more affordable housing, but I don't think that they need to be building more affordable housing on the backs of workers who aren't getting paid a fair wage for their work.
Well, let's just clear that up really quick, because I'm not suggesting that people shouldn't be paid a fair wage or even a good wage. But is fair wage and state prevailing wage always the same number?
I think it depends, but yeah, generally. I mean, that's kind of why it exists, right?
I mean, depending on how the economy works, the fair wage might actually go down, but the state prevailing wage might have to stay the same. And therefore, there would be a sort of gap that does, at the end of the day, pencil less units in our community. Isn't that a discussion that is valid having?
It's all the discussions are valid having as long as they come with correct data. I think that what we have found, at least with Desert Pines, is there's capital out there that would prefer that, and we were able to attract, hundreds of millions of dollars in the community because that project is prevailing wage. That project would not have happened if it weren't paying the wages that were happening, right? The capital demanded it. And I think that's really important, right? Like, all affordable housing is going to be a public-private partnership by its nature. And so we have to work with the private sector and meet the capital where it is. Our office chooses to spend our time on projects that, pay a wage that benefits the community, so that that's not another problem down the road. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't build all the affordable housing we can. It just means that we got to balance the needs of multiple constituents, just like with everything else.
No, I get that. And I just heard from some developers or people involved in the development realm that they could build way more if there weren't some of these requirements. But I don't think anyone's talking about exploiting labor, just kind of not being tied into the statutory requirement.
Yeah, and I think, that's what makes a market, right? Some developers choose to pay higher wages and make lower profits. Some developers choose to get land from the federal government or from the state government and then have restrictions placed upon that land because of the source and where it came from. Some developers build market rate housing and don't interact with a lot of these rules at all, right?
Yeah.
These are all choices. And our job in the state isn't to pick winners or losers. Our job is to make sure that there are opportunities available for people who want to do whatever they want to do, as long as it's generally beneficial to the common good.
Zach, is there anything else that we haven't discussed that can utilize the power of your Office of the Treasurer to address issues like housing affordability in our community?
I think our job in the Treasury, outside of making sure that we have more resources available to do this work in the future, kind of across the board, right? Whatever the need of the community is. But our job, we really think, is to center housing in all the different conversations that we have. So if we have state has an economic development conversation, what is that going to do to housing? And are we prepared for it, right? If the state has a conversation about attracting more or better teachers, if we have a conversation about attracting more or better medical professionals, how do we make sure that there's a housing component as part of that, or at least we're thinking about housing, because it really is such an existential need, right? It is on the Maslow's hierarchy, right? It shows up pretty close to the beginning. And so if we don't solve that problem, other problems get harder.
Zach Conine, State Treasurer for the great state of Nevada. Thank you so much for coming on CityCast Las Vegas. Appreciate you always.
Thanks for having us.
That's all for today here on CityCast Las Vegas. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend? Hey, you can tell them all the things you learned about the Treasurer's Office from this episode. You can also go and rate our show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Till then, stay lucky.